So this is going to be the second installment of So You Want to Talk About Race. And what we're really doing this week is saying, what is racism? And I'll tell you, I mean, it was both kind of what I expected and not what I expected. So as we jump into it, one of the things that I won't say I'm enjoying doing, but it is interesting to do, is kind of tying this particular work to things that we can find in the Bible. And one of the things that I read on a different website when I was researching this was that biblically, racism was not really a thing so much as tribalism or sectarianism. And you know, the author of that particular piece fully admitted that it's very likely that the kind of tribalism and sectarianism that we find in the Bible grew into what we think of as racism, but that back in the day, you know, the people in Rome or, you know, in Jerusalem or whatever, an Ethiopian prince shows up, they're treated like a prince, you know, not like, oh, that person has black skin, you know, let's throw them in chains and you know, put them on a chain gang or something. It was very different. But you take a look at some of the things that we find, particularly back in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So this is very common for some of the things that you'll find in you know, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, some of those. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, you know, okay, all those other folks, 7 nations more numerous and mighty than yourselves. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you and he would destroy you quickly. So it becomes very much a, you know, kind of about religious purity more than about any other thing. Another thing that I found very interesting was...
We lost Haley for a bit. You want to wait and see if she comes back?
Oh, good point.
Yeah, she dropped off.
All right.
It's just one of those days, I guess.
Yeah.
And Natalie did respond. She's got an aunt and uncle over with her, so that's why, or that's what's keeping her busy. And I haven't heard from Nikki at all today.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
hopefully I'm sure she's okay. It's just...
Yeah, everybody gets to take a day off.
Yeah.
Well, I hope we didn't lose Haley permanently.
Oh, she's back. She's back.
No, yeah.
Okay.
I've been having trouble with it. It gives me an error number 5 and kicks me out. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Technology.
It happened at the last Zoom meeting I was
stuff.
on, so I haven't figured it out.
That's all right. So one of the things that if you dig into the descriptions of biblical slavery, there's some things in there that really set it apart from slavery the way it was practiced in this country, right? And you know, on the one hand, there is this very clear idea that a slave is somebody's property. And, you know, like from Exodus, when a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Okay.
So specific.
Yeah, it is. It's you know, when people today talk about human capital, I mean, it's an echo of this same thing. I remember, geez, you know, it's very patriarchal, and I remember my dad talking about us kids, as being, quote, on the payroll, unquote. In other words, if he was helping you financially, he expected your obedience. It was a very, very, and back in the day when we were younger, and he was still married to my mom, there was, plenty of using the rod on everybody involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, it all comes out of this. It's really crazy. But what they did not have, even though they owned people and could beat them, right, was they couldn't just go steal them like we did, right? And it says in Exodus, I mean, black and white, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. So the biblical penalty for what the American slave trade was doing was death. And then in terms of who could, the idea was that slavery was more of a voluntary servitude in order to avoid starving to death. So many of those people lived in really, dirt poor poverty. And if you were not a landowner, if you did not have a successful, agricultural endeavor, you or your family could very easily starve. So what a lot of people did when they had nothing else is they would sell themselves. They would, like the kid in the Prodigal Son. He was like, hey, I got nothing left. And so, he ended up working for a Gentile, and that was really not even being fed as well as the pigs, which is why he ran away and went back home to his dad. Mm-hmm. And for cases like that, when it's like, hey, your family is down on their luck, they even had a rule for that. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. So it's a very different dynamic than the kind of slavery, the way it ended up happening. Now, were there people who did steal people and sell them? Well, there must have been, or they wouldn't have made a rule against it.
Yeah.
Right? But they did make a rule against it, and they did, try to exercise a tradition where it was basically only those people that really needed slavery, that needed to be a slave to stay alive, would sell themselves into slavery. I found this quote by Martin Luther King, and I thought that it really said a lot about who we are as a nation. And for an African American man who was, part of the civil rights movement, to really go back and look at what we did to Native Americans, I thought was both extremely generous of spirit and uniquely insightful. And he said our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shore, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. And boy, do I think he hit the nail right on the head right there. I mean, that really does say everything. And it really speaks to the arrogance of the European colonists who thought that, well, these people are savages, so it's okay if we kill them and take their land. And I continue to be deeply mortified at the way that our indigenous population is treated today. It blows my mind. There are 2 million Americans who have no running water, and the vast majority of them are Native Americans, and there's just no excuse for that. So, with this as a background, we take a look and say, well, how do we define racism for us today? All right. And the author says that racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race. Well, that sounds pretty simple. But then she says, or you could also say that racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race when those views are reinforced by systems of power. And boy, does that really nail it. Because, quite frankly, if Bob walking down the street has something against me because of my race, well, that doesn't really mean a whole heck of a lot. I could care less, But if Bob and the people like him have the power to change my life and livelihood and maybe even take my life away from me, now we got a problem. And she actually gets at that. And I think it's a really important thing for me today. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But, when she says, which means more, which of those definitions means more, she says, when we use only the first definition of racism as any prejudice against someone based on race, we inaccurately reduce issues of race in America to a battle for the hearts and minds of individual racists, instead of seeing racist behaviors and racist oppressions as part of a larger system. And, I found this, like this badge or whatever it is, the system isn't broken, the system is racist. And that's exactly right. Our system is not broken. It's operating the way it was designed, by, colonial era slaveholders, rich white guys that wanted to be able to use other people, use their stuff, use their lives to make more for themselves. And, we've tried tweaking it a little bit in teeny places here and there over the centuries, but the centuries, the system that has survived these centuries has still got a lot of racism in it, and it was designed that way. And this really sums up. You don't have to be a racist to be racist. She says what's important is that the impotent hatred of the virulent racist was built and nurtured by a system that has much more insidiously woven a quieter yet no less violent version of those same oppressive beliefs into the fabric of our society. The truth is, you don't even have to be racist to be part of a racist system. And boy, I mean, that to me is what white privilege is all about. If you had to try to define white privilege for somebody, you could tell them you don't have to be racist to be part of a racist system. And being white in that system is a completely different experience than being a racial minority in that system. And as it says over in the little piece of artwork that I found, racism is a system that was designed to justify the fact that Europeans converted African human beings into private property for profit. And it's a system that we all live in, and that is exactly the truth. So what can we do about that, right? It's not just a matter of us changing individual attitudes. And in some cases, there are going to be individual attitudes we never have any hope of changing. She says that systemic racism is a machine that runs whether we pull the levers or not. And by just letting it be, we are responsible for what it produces. We have to actually dismantle the machine if we want to make change. It's not enough to be not a racist. We have to be anti-racist. And it's not enough for us to attack the attitudes of individual racists, which is what I find myself doing on Facebook sometimes. And I really need to start picking my battles a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like, but it's really about changing the system. So I want to try to really readjust my thinking cap and get into doing things that are going to have a better effect. And I think what she's saying is that we need to affect the system more than we need to affect those individuals who some of whom have actual racist tendencies. And I love this. She says, we cannot look at a society where racial inequity is so universal and longstanding and say this is all the doing of a few individuals with hate in their hearts. It just doesn't make sense. And it's so obvious, in all of the mass shootings, especially the mass shootings done by, white guys, right? It's always, oh, well, this lone wolf, unbalanced person. And it's very different when the face of the person committing the crime is a person of color. And this meme I found, one country, two systems, is very, very true. Dylan Roof, after he murdered those 9 people, they bought him some Burger King, and when he was being transferred from one jail to another, they would actually put a bulletproof vest on him to keep him from being hurt. George Floyd was suspected of forging $20, and he was killed by police. And that's just an example. If you look, you can go back years and take a look at how many white guys who perpetrated mass shootings were captured peacefully.
Mm-hmm.
And take a look at how many unarmed black people died at the hands of police. It is, it's shameful. It's just shameful. And it's not just the doing of a few individuals with hate in their hearts. That's not it. Sorry, not buying it at all. So, what do we do about racists? And I love this little piece of art, but sadly, all those people will not be able, we can't offer them all to the dark goddess and have their bloods cleanse the land. You can't, people, they frown on you when you start taking a sickle to people and doing that stuff. It sounds good on paper, and it's kind of cute on the internet, but we really can't. What we have to do is we have to acknowledge racism as part of the system. And instead of limiting our ability to win over racists, we focus on how our actions interact with systemic racism. So it's, forget trying to convince, my grandmother, mother, brother, buddy from the army, somebody I work with, one of my friends' friends on Facebook, who just doesn't get it. I need to forget trying to convince those people about what racism is and what systemic racism is, and just work on dismantling the system. And, we have to remember this, that the ultimate goal of racism was the profit and comfort of the white race, specifically of rich white men. And I mean, she just nails it. The oppression of people of color was an easy way to get this wealth and power, and racism was a good way to justify it. And, I know we're supposed to not mix politics and religion, which is kind of laughable, but these same guys that did this were the same guys that wrote our Constitution. So, there's some things that probably need to be addressed there. Just saying. And one thing that I think we have to be willing to address and to try to help people with is the idea that the fact that we're calling the system racist doesn't mean that we don't like white people, or that we're against white people, or that all white people are bad, whatever. It's not about anti-white bigotry. It's about making it a level playing field. Now, here's the thing is, if you have privilege, whether you're willing to admit it or not, and somebody starts to level the playing field, that may feel like bigotry against you, Sorry. we have had unfair advantages for time immemorial. Since the first ship hit the ground, on this continent, for sure. And undoing that, we're going to have to, we have a. So when I was learning real estate, they used to talk about real estate as a bundle of rights. And, when you were transferring title, you were transferring the whole bundle. But you could also sell certain rights, like the right to occupy, that's renting. Or you could sell the mineral rights. And in fact, most real estate that's transferred in the United States now, you don't get the mineral rights. They were, somebody else, got them a long, long time ago, right? But white people's bundle of rights, whether you want to admit it or not, in our society has been bigger than black people's and brown people's and red people's since day one. And even though a lot of those rights are unofficial, we still have them. And some of them are like leftovers from before. I mean, the whole accumulation of wealth thing, the accumulation of wealth that's gone on in the disparity between what was available for white families and what was available for black families. Well, we have this great big bundle of stuff that they don't have because there was never any, okay, wait, time out. We're going to catch everybody up. We haven't done that yet. When we talk about making reparations, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about taking a time out and saying, you know what, we're going to even Steven this thing. And of course, the people with the big bundle look at that as being against them. And it's not. It's just not. We're just trying to make things fair. So what do? We got to eat the elephant. And the way that we eat the elephant is one bite at a time, right? And I really like this particular, it's a very simple little drawing, but it really shows the different areas that we need to take a look at addressing, right? And education at the top is a huge one, because if we can get people educated properly, it's going to help their health. It's going to help their employment. It's going to help where they end up in the community. It's going to help their housing. It's going to help their criminal justice outcomes. But each of those separate things is an area that is currently not equal. And we need to basically start looking at each one of those as what we in the military would call a line of effort. And then we need to start, operationally moving down each of those lines of effort, and hopefully doing it in a way that, the steps that we're taking in education are going to improve outcomes in employment, and that the steps in health, are also going to improve both education and employment, and the steps that we take in employment are going to improve housing, and the steps that we take in employment and housing are going to improve criminal justice. So that there's a synergy between the incremental steps that we take along the way that help us get to an end place faster. So it's interesting when we look at that, okay, I'm going to move you into Israel and you're going to kill everybody that's there, that we found back in Leviticus, right? When we take a look at, the people who learned from Jesus or who learned from some of his disciples, and we see what they have to say about, how do we treat the other among us? And James says, you do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbors as yourself. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. That's just a great piece of scripture. And then in John, whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Which kind of leads us to this, that, this is something that I think we all have heard a bunch of times. But boy, we're a long way from living it. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. Love one another. And ultimately, that's the answer. is to treat each other like we love one another. And then, we won't be able to answer that question, what is racism? Because it won't be there. So.